Everyone thinks they know what Bushido is. The way of the warrior. 7 sacred virtues. Honor above life itself. The ancient code that guided samurai for 1,000 years. Here's the problem. Bushido wasn't ancient. It was largely constructed and systematized in 1900 by a Christian educator who had never been a samurai to reshape how the world saw Japan. And it worked so well that it rewrote history itself. Welcome to Japan Rewind, where the myths end and the real history begins. Which of course begs the obvious question. If Bushido wasn't the unified ancient samurai code, then what system actually controlled these warriors? And how did a modern political construction become so embedded that even today, most people believe it represents authentic medieval Japanese values? The deception starts with the word Bushido itself. Most people assume this term has been used for centuries to describe samurai ethics. But if you search through historical documents from the Heian, Kamakura, or even most of the Edo periods, you'll find something revealing. The word Bushido, meaning way of the warrior, appears only sporadically in samurai writings before the late 1800s. The terms that actual medieval samurai more commonly used were Bushi no Michi, or simply the way of the warrior. But these referred to practical military customs and varied regional practices, not a unified philosophical code of ethics. The Bushido we know today was primarily constructed and popularized by one man, Nitobe Inazo, a Christian educator who wrote Bushido, the Soul of Japan in 1900. Nitobe wasn't a samurai. He had never lived under the samurai system. He was a Meiji-era intellectual who was reshaping Japanese identity for Western consumption. But here's the crucial part. He wasn't describing historical reality as it existed. He was engineering an idealized version of what he thought samurai values should have been, mixing Christian ethics, Western chivalric ideals, and selective interpretations of Japanese philosophy into a coherent system that had never existed in such unified form. Nitobe's construction became incredibly successful in the West because it presented Japan as a noble, spiritual civilization with values that Westerners could understand and respect. The timing was perfect. Japan was emerging as a modern power, and the West needed a framework to make sense of this mysterious Asian nation. Bushido provided that system. It made Japan seem less foreign and more relatable by presenting it through the lens of European knightly ideals. But the real samurai system was far more complex than Nitobe's construction. If you examine actual historical documents written by samurai during their active period, you find a very different set of control mechanisms and priorities. The Hojo clan's code from 1232 focuses almost entirely on practical matters: how to maintain your equipment, how to treat your horses, how to manage your household finances, and how to avoid getting drunk on duty. There's very little about abstract honor and virtually nothing about dying before being dishonored. The famous Hagakure, often cited as the ultimate expression of Bushido, was actually written in the early 1700s by Yamamoto Tsunetomo, a samurai who had never seen real combat. He was writing during the peaceful Edo period, romanticizing a warrior culture that was already disappearing. Even more importantly, the Hagakure was considered radical and dangerous by the Tokugawa government, who banned it because they thought it encouraged reckless behavior. This wasn't mainstream samurai thinking across Japan. It was the nostalgic fantasy of someone who missed the old system, representing one perspective rather than universal samurai values. The real control structures of historical samurai were much more pragmatic and varied considerably across regions and time periods. First and foremost was loyalty to their lord, but this loyalty was often conditional and transactional. though it could also be deeply personal and absolute, depending on circumstances. Samurai regularly switched sides when it benefited them, or when their current lord could no longer provide for them. The idea of absolute, unwavering loyalty regardless of circumstances was more common in some periods and regions than others, and was later emphasized and systematized during the modern era. Second was the maintenance of their social and economic position. Samurai were a hereditary class whose primary concern was often preserving their status and income. They fought not primarily for abstract ideals of honor, but to protect their land grants, their family's position, and their access to resources. Many samurai spent more time on administrative duties, tax collection, and estate management than they ever did fighting. Third was practical military effectiveness. Real samurai codes focused heavily on tactics, strategy, and the practical aspects of warfare. They were professional soldiers who understood that staying alive and winning battles was generally more important than dying gloriously. The romantic notion of preferring death to defeat was present in some contexts, but was largely absent from mainstream samurai military thinking throughout most periods. The economic reality of samurai life also contradicts the unified Bushido narrative. Many samurai were desperately poor, especially during the peaceful Edo period when their military skills became largely irrelevant. They took on side jobs, borrowed money, and engaged in commerce despite official prohibitions against such activities. The idea of samurai being universally above material concerns is at odds with historical evidence showing them frequently worried about money and social status. The relationship between samurai and their lords was also much more varied and transactional than the Bushido construction suggests. Lords were generally expected to provide for their retainers through land grants, stipends, and opportunities for advancement. When lords failed to do this, samurai often felt justified in seeking better opportunities elsewhere. The famous concept of the masterless ronin wasn't usually the result of a lord's death, but more commonly of economic disputes or political disagreements that led samurai to leave their service. Even the famous samurai weapons and fighting styles present a more complex picture than the Bushido narrative suggests. The katana, now seen as the soul of the samurai, was actually a secondary weapon for much of samurai history. The primary weapons were typically the bow and arrow, followed by the spear. Samurai were mounted archers first and swordsmen second, though the cultural importance of the sword did grow over time. The mystical reverence for the sword was largely emphasized during the peaceful Edo period, when samurai had fewer opportunities to distinguish themselves through actual combat. The real transformation of samurai identity happened during the Meiji Restoration, when the new government needed to construct a sense of national identity and military spirit. The Meiji leaders took selective elements from samurai history, combined them with Western military ideals, and engineered a new mythology that served their political needs. This wasn't an attempt to preserve authentic samurai culture as it had actually existed. It was an attempt to construct a modern Japanese identity that could compete with Western powers. The government promoted this systematized version of Bushido through education, military training, and popular culture. School children were taught that ancient samurai had lived by these noble principles, and that modern Japanese should follow their example. The military used Bushido concepts to encourage soldiers to fight to the death rather than surrender. The entire society was indoctrinated with the idea that self-sacrifice for the emperor and the state was the highest form of honor. This manufactured Bushido became a weapon during World War II, when the Japanese military used it to justify kamikaze attacks, suicidal resistance, and the refusal to surrender even in hopeless situations. Soldiers were told they were following the ancient way of the samurai, when, in reality, they were following a modern political ideology that had been systematized less than 50 years earlier. The system had evolved from cultural explanation to military control mechanism, with devastating consequences. The international spread of Bushido mythology was accelerated by Japan's own cultural exports. After World War II, Japan began promoting a sanitized version of its history that emphasized the noble, spiritual aspects of samurai culture while downplaying the brutal realities of feudal warfare. Movies, books, and martial arts schools around the world embraced this romanticized version because it was more appealing than the complex historical reality. Modern martial arts played a particularly important role in spreading Bushido constructions. Many martial arts schools, both in Japan and internationally, adopted Bushido concepts as part of their teaching philosophy. Students were taught that they were learning not just fighting techniques, but ancient spiritual principles. This gave martial arts a sense of depth and authenticity that appealed to Western practitioners looking for meaning beyond physical training. The problem is that most of these martial arts had little direct connection to actual samurai fighting methods. Modern karate, judo, and aikido were created in the late 1800s and early 1900s, incorporating elements from various fighting traditions, but designed for civilian practice rather than battlefield combat. The Bushido philosophy taught in these schools was often more influenced by Nitobe's construction than by any specific authentic samurai tradition. The economic incentives for promoting Bushido mythology are also significant. Japan's tourism industry benefits enormously from the romantic image of noble samurai warriors. Millions of visitors come to Japan each year hoping to experience authentic samurai culture, and the country has built an entire industry around providing that experience. Museums, historical sites, and cultural performances often promote the systematized Bushido version of samurai history because it's what tourists expect to see. The entertainment industry, both Japanese and international, has also found Bushido mythology incredibly profitable. Movies, television shows, video games, and books about samurai almost universally portray them as noble warriors guided by ancient codes of honor. This version sells much better than stories about pragmatic medieval soldiers worried about their tax obligations and rice stipends. What makes this particularly revealing is how the Bushido construction has obscured the real systems and complexities of samurai history. The actual samurai were fascinating figures who developed sophisticated military, political, and administrative structures that varied across regions and evolved over time. They created art, literature, and philosophy that reflected their real experiences and concerns. But much of this authentic history has been overshadowed by a romantic fantasy that was constructed for modern political purposes. The real samurai were neither the noble paragons of virtue portrayed in Bushido mythology, nor the bloodthirsty barbarians sometimes depicted in reaction to that mythology. They were complex human beings operating within specific historical and social contexts, trying to balance competing demands of loyalty, survival, advancement, and family welfare. Their actual codes and customs were practical responses to the realities of medieval Japanese life, varying by region and period, rather than timeless universal spiritual principles. Understanding the real history of samurai systems also helps explain many aspects of modern Japanese culture that seem contradictory when viewed through the unified Bushido lens. The emphasis on group harmony, the importance of social hierarchy, the complex obligations between superiors and subordinates, and the pragmatic approach to loyalty and duty all make more sense when understood as evolved versions of actual samurai practices rather than applications of constructed philosophical principles. The persistence of Bushido mythology also reveals something important about how historical narratives are constructed and maintained. When a story serves the interests of powerful institutions, whether governments, educational systems, or entertainment industries, it can become accepted as historical fact, even when it contradicts much of the available evidence. The Bushido construction has survived because it serves the needs of modern Japan, international martial arts communities, and global entertainment markets. So the next time you hear someone talk about the ancient samurai code of Bushido, remember that you're hearing a story that was largely systematized less than 125 years ago by a Christian educator who was trying to make Japan seem respectable to Western audiences. The real samurai had their own codes and customs that varied across time and region, but they were based on practical necessities rather than abstract universal ideals. The authentic samurai legacy is actually more interesting than the manufactured one. These were real people dealing with real problems, creating solutions that worked within their specific historical contexts. That's a much more valuable lesson than any romantic fantasy about noble warriors dying for honor. If this revealed how deeply you've been sold a version of history that was constructed to serve modern interests, hit that like button. Share this with someone who still believes in the Hollywood version of Bushido. Drop a comment below with what other carefully constructed Japanese myths you want us to expose next. And subscribe to Japan Rewind, because the real systems that shape Japan's past are always more fascinating than the stories they built to hide them.